Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Counterpoint Podcast. My name is Maurice, and I'll once again be your host for this episode. And with me, I have my colleague, Senior Research Analyst Glenn Cardoza, on the line, and we'll be talking about a very interesting topic. This time around, we'll be discussing the Southeast Asian market, where he has some expertise in, and we're looking into discussing actually, we're doing a follow up on what is happening with COVID-19, what happened in 2020. We actually did a podcast before on the market. We'll link to it in this podcast as well. But basically, we're trying to expand on what we previously talked about, what happened with social distancing, lockdowns, how the online channel grew, and other dynamics that are happening in the market. So, welcome, Glenn.
Hi, Maurice. It's really good to be part of this podcast.
Great. So let's start off again with the kind of the basics here. So when we talk about the Southeast Asian market, which countries are we including here?
So, yeah, Southeast Asia covers 11 countries. It's a mix of many small and big developing nations, and most of which are quite promising. The main economies, however, the ones to look out for would be Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. These four hold a lot of potential, and they are currently growing.
Gotcha. So we'll be looking at those four major markets, I assume. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they're different from each other? In terms of GDP or geography or population and culture?
Yeah, so although they are part of the same region, Maurice, they are quite different from each other. So you mentioned population, that's one factor that's quite differentiating. For example, in Indonesia, they have a total of more than 270 million of a population. It's the biggest economy in Southeast Asia. So that becomes a quite a big entry point, for any brand that is looking to get into new markets. That Indonesia is followed by Philippines, Vietnam, and then Thailand. So the way each of these countries have been dealing with COVID-19 as well, that's been different. The effect of the pandemic on them has been different. So many things have changed since the last podcast that we had on Southeast Asia. See, for example, let's look at other factors. Indonesia and Philippines, at least for the COVID-19, have been able to deal with the situation with over an extended period. And Thailand and Vietnam, well, they recuperated a little earlier. The presence of a relatively younger population is common among all these countries. So what makes this region and most of its countries very attractive is the fact that the population is pretty vibrant, a big proportion of young, digital savvy population. So that's kind of given the push to the online adoption as well for this particular region.
Got you. So interesting. So some of these market drivers, young population, online savvy. But how about this? 2020 was a particularly tough year, I think, for everyone with the outbreak, lockdowns happening in countries, and after that initial hit of COVID, we saw some pent up demand because of people working from home and school also becoming homeschooling, which is the new norm now. But with all that, what happened to the smartphone market and the performance in these countries? Was there kind of like a decline there? Was it flat, or did we even see growth?
Yeah. So interestingly, you mentioned one thing that actually opened up the economy for these countries in the region. The pent-up demand is one big factor for this region. So the first two quarters in 2020 saw a decline due to the pandemic, obviously, and subsequent issues that followed. And this was seen across all the SEA, the Southeast Asian countries. But by the start of the third quarter in the year, we saw the market open up. So as people conform to their new requirements, the new normal, the need for their smartphone increased with, like you mentioned, working from home, the studies and courses being done by children from home, and every other aspect of their life that depended even a little bit on smartphones changed. So there was a different kind of dependence on smartphones, and that was seen in the last two quarters of 2020. Mostly every demographic contributed to the rise in sales. in the second half of 2020, there was a surge in smartphone sales, almost 10% across all four Southeast Asian countries. That's quite a jump. And markets like Indonesia and Thailand grew more than others. While it could not cover up the loss in the first half of the year, the sales in the second half showed us quite a potential for these markets.
And right, and I think this is something especially for us, we've had a lot of discussions on in terms of like how will this COVID-19 impact happen? Is it a V-shaped recovery? Is it a W-shaped recovery? You had all these different types of scenarios, and so for this instance, it's essentially a V-shaped recovery, correct?
Yes, you could call that a V-shaped recovery. It's something that brought it down in the first two quarters of last year, but then we see it come up right up there and then sustain itself. It's kind of the same thing we look forward to in 2021 as well.
Gotcha. So what about then are the key factors contributing to the growth? I mean, you already mentioned pent up demand. Is there anything else that happened? Were operators more aggressive with their service plans, or were OEMs doing some pricing that changed kind of the market?
Yes, Maurice. So pent-up demand, like you mentioned, obviously was one of the main factors, but that's the demand part of it. If you look at the supply aspect, brands were quick to realize that if offline networks were not doing justice to the demand, online channels should be concentrated on more. And this began quite early. It started in the first quarter of 2020 itself. It gave a much needed convenience aspect to consumers, and it reduced the risk element during lockdowns and curbs as well. So there were many sales and marketing initiatives over WhatsApp, many other online platforms, home deliveries, which are specialized, flash sales, etc. All these were done in a very well timed manner. Aggressive pricing, online occasion based offers, all these are quite normal. Uh, but they got quite a push in the last two quarters, especially in the last quarter of 2020. We believe that most consumers saw value in the low to mid range smartphones. They are price sensitive markets. I mean, in Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, especially, they are quite price sensitive. And brands had foreseen this demand, made sure that the supply meets the demand. And that's how their distribution, supply chain, and everything else worked.
Right. And when you mention these are really price sensitive markets, and what comes to mind to me is, we have certain, big OEMs that manufacture and that really compete in this price range. So, globally, Samsung is one of these big players who are for the most part, the number one leader in the market. However, Samsung has also been losing share as of late, and where that's coming from, I believe, is these Chinese smartphone makers, such as Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, and others gaining share. So what in particular are these brands doing to differentiate and be able to capture some share from Samsung?
Yes. So Samsung, it's an old player and they have quite a base set even in Southeast Asia. So this has been changing over the last few quarters, and it started in quite before the pandemic itself. So Chinese brands, especially like the ones you mentioned, Oppo, Vivo, Realme, and Xiaomi, were the actual main brands who started the online channel push in early 2020. Samsung as well was with them in this case. Therefore, their focus on the economical range gave them a bit of an advantage over the markets. So Oppo, Vivo, Realme, Xiaomi, all four of them have a good uh, variety in their offerings with regards to entry level smartphones, mid all up to mid range smartphones. While Samsung is still a strong brand in this region, they have a good online settling and a very good partnership with the online channel and offline channel networks. The Chinese brands took many initiatives to capture a healthy consumer mind share. Now, mind you, this was required because these Chinese brands are relatively quite new compared to Samsung. So they realized this. Brands like Oppo and Vivo worked out of the box marketing initiatives. They have also maintained their offerings in the mid to high range smartphones. For example, Oppo, Vivo have their X series range, and they cater to all the demographic, whether they are on the lower end of the economy scale or the higher end. They made sure that they have a respectable variety of offering. While 5G is still yet to be commercialized in these markets, these brands have come out not only with the 5G models, but also made sure they had the 4G variants for the same. Now, that is something that worked for these brands as well. All these initiatives and a lot more that they've done over the course of 2020, at least in the last 2 quarters, all have made sure that they are quite strong competitors to Samsung.
And this has been great, and I wanted to kind of pick up on something you just mentioned regarding online sales, right, and the online growth through these brands. Um, as you rightly said, the online channel has been growing, and I wanted to kind of understand a little bit more how these brands and these e-commerce portals are actually working together in order to innovate and kind of grow their share there.
Yes, the brands are quite active online. So brands in the SCA region have had their online affiliations even pre-COVID. So most brands believed in a multi-platform approach. They made sure that they are not partnered with only the biggest players, but made sure that they are there even with the up and comers. Uh, the online platforms were working with them on new launches, making sure that their current well-to-do models are right there up there. And the distribution network for online channels would definitely be a bit more easier than the offline that they would have to cater to. So overall sales, even during the pandemic, was pretty high. The online emphasis, no doubt, definitely made a big difference. The highest difference towards uh, the start of the year, and then as the market started opening in the third and fourth quarter, the online just gave the much needed push to offline to make sure that they made up some part while getting rid of their stock. So, for example, Xiaomi and Realme, they lead the Southeast Asian markets with their online channel sales. So it's the biggest proportion of their overall sales. While they are leading, the other brands are not far behind. So Vivo, Xiaomi, I'm sorry, Vivo, Oppo, Samsung, all have a very active online proportion of sales as well. While online proportion of sales it kept increasing in 2020. In the fourth quarter itself, we saw about 6% year-on-year increase in online sales. That's quite a jump for the last quarter of the year. This is commendable for this region particularly. We see online proportion of sales going up in 2021 as well.
Yeah, a 6% year-over-year increase is quite a lot, especially for these regions. I agree, but can you actually tell us a little bit more about these online platforms? Who are they? Can you just list some names, and also how do you see, or do you see actually any changes happening in terms of the dynamics for online channels going forward?
Yes, so there has been a lot going on with regards to online platforms in these countries. The brands understand that online marketplaces and e-commerce websites gather more click-fall compared to the brand's own online portal. So in this region, Lazada has led the charge with online smartphone sales, but Shopee has been gaining with the highest growth in 2020. And this has been seen overall across all the main economies. There have been an increased number of investments, especially from Chinese stakeholders who are betting big on the online channels in this region. There are also relatively smaller players like Tokopedia is one such player, which is not exactly small. It's been there in the Indonesian market for a long time. It's not as aggressive with smartphone sales as Lazada and Shopee currently, but they have a big potential. They're looking at maybe gaining a little synergy from other ecosystem players. There are different other smaller players like Bukalapak, Akulaku, and other ones which are set in the Chinese market like JD.com. All these are relying heavily on increasing their overall online sales for smartphones, especially. So JD.com would be in Indonesia, Thailand. The dynamics are changing as the overall online channel heats up. With COVID-19 not really decelerating at this point, we see the focus on these online channels increasing in this current year as well.
Awesome. And now I kind of wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about offline channels and the dynamics you're seeing there. So just from a U.S. perspective, we have Best Buy as one of the major retailers here. Um, Brick and mortar retailers, as we call them. So Best Buy has actually been trying to switch a lot of their strategy, turning some of their stores into actual fulfillment centers, so they're able to boost their online presence more, boost online sales, and get shipping more expedited that way. Have you seen, or what have you seen in terms of what the offline channels have been doing? Have they had any recovery, or have they even switched to kind of like a model like I mentioned for Best Buy?
Yes, Maurice, that's an interesting model you mentioned for the US, but it's a bit different in Southeast Asia. They haven't, as much as we know, they haven't done any such thing to take over, what infrastructure and what facilities they have for offline onto online to build online. So it's a bit different across brands for in this region. All the main brands have their own strategy for channel sales. For example, even as the pandemic raged, brands like Vivo and Oppo continued their increased focus on their offline network. They are known for an offline strong network, and they kept their focus on that particular aspect. They did build their online as well, although as we see, it's not exactly the main channel that gives them the sales. They did build it up to some potential, however. Whereas if you look at brands like Xiaomi and Realme, well, they were the ones who led the online charge. They still are, but their strategy also it was a mix of offline and online. They are currently making sure that they increase their distribution, the network of online stores, different formats of stores, kiosks, everything that's being done is in line with what is required for the region for these particular countries. Online, definitely. Offline, definitely. So Xiaomi and Realme, they have been giving equal importance to both. This is the key for their growth in the region, actually. And Samsung has had a long standing with the partnerships that they have with online players, which will continue, and their offline network remains relatively strong as well. Looking at this, you have other brands, other Chinese brands like the transient brands as well, like Techno, Infinix, which are quite strong online, apart from the main brands that you see in this region.
Thanks, Glenn. Those are some really interesting dynamics I think you've mentioned for both, the online and offline channels we're seeing in Southeast Asia. But, I wanted to touch upon one last thing, which is kind of tangentially related, and it's on the production and manufacturing that happens in these countries, such as Vietnam and the Philippines. Like we have seen, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of factories closing down in China, which massively affected the supply of smartphones globally. So a lot of OEMs are actually trying to diversify their manufacturing capabilities so that they can reduce risks, right? And what makes these other nations or countries attractive for OEMs to look into for manufacturing and investment?
Yes, this is quite an important part, Maurice. So, brands recognize the importance of Southeast Asia not just because of the demand and the consumer base that they have or the profile and demographics. They also look at it from a manufacturing investment point of view. So, for example, like you rightly said, there's one country that stands out. Vietnam has been leading the charge. It's quite pro manufacturing, pro investment that its approach it has had, and it's the best in Southeast Asia at this point. It's incentives to international companies, its FDI policies, low cost skilled labor, and the free trade agreements that they have are relatively much better than the other countries in this region. These are the main factors which work for Vietnam currently. And that's the reason it's quite attractive for corporates, for brands, international brands who want to set up uh, their production units in this country. Samsung, for example, is one such brand which has been producing in Vietnam for quite some time. It makes up a big proportion of their manufacturing bulk. Due to their history in manufacturing for Samsung, there are other brands like Foxconn, Xiaomi. They've recently taken a lot of interest and started their initiatives in this country as well. Indonesia is another country. It has a potential for the production, but at this point is not as ahead as Vietnam is. So apart from India, Southeast Asia is the only other region getting the benefit as production processes continue to move out of China, like you mentioned. So this trend will continue as we see the US-China situation is quite volatile at this point. We look at this region gaining not only through consumers but also through through business, through trade, and its relationship with international manufacturers.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a huge topic, and I think that we can probably spend another podcast on this very thing, right?
True, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to end it here then. Thanks, Glenn, for yeah, talking about this. It's been really enlightening.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, again for listening and staying with us for this podcast. As always, you can find us on counterpointresearch.com, as well as the major other podcast websites and places such as Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Stitcher, and Spotify. Hope that you guys have a great day, and until next time, take care.